Dungeons & Dragons is a massive failure in Japan. The 5th edition, the current one, the most successful version in history with over 50 million players worldwide, has sold just 10,000 copies in Japan. And that's insane, because Japan gave us Delicious in Dungeon, Frieren, Dragon Quest, and a huge list of other stories that clearly take a lot from D&D. So how does the biggest tabletop RPG in the world become almost extinct in the country that loves fantasy the most? Because here's the thing, it wasn't always like this. There was a moment where D&D ruled Japan. So what happened? Why did D&D fail in Japan? How did something that failed so hard ended up being so influential even today? And how does understanding this explain the way Japan sees fantasy versus how the West does? But to make any of this make sense, we first need to go back to the creation of Dungeons & Dragons and the entire tabletop RPG genre, because that's where we will find the seeds of why D&D couldn't replicate its worldwide success in Japan. The year is 1974. Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson published D&D in the United States, a tabletop game where the player takes the role of an adventurer, navigating a world of monsters, magic, and choices. What made it special and different from anything else on the market at the time was that it took the best elements from the war games that came before it, like Kriegspiel, Little Wars, Baronstein, Braunstein, all designed to stimulate the chaos and strategy of real warfare, and gave them a completely new twist. Unlike traditional strategy games where you commanded entire armies, D&D focused the experience on a small group of players who each took the role of an individual adventurer in a magical world. You could be a warrior, a wizard, a thief, a cleric, and your character could level up over time, so there was always a sense of progress. There were dungeons that were huge and complex, filled with traps, puzzles, and secrets that forced you to explore, map, and manage your resources carefully. It wasn't just about killing monsters, it was about surviving the dungeon itself. D&D was heavily influenced by the epic fantasy of the Lord of the Rings, and it made you feel like you were part of a grand story, good versus evil, you and your best friends against the world. That was something totally new at the time. Keep in mind, the first video game in history had only come out 3 years before, and it looked like this, just a couple blinking dots on a screen. So if you wanted to know what it felt like to be the hero of your own fantasy story, besides choose your own adventure books, which were pretty limited and didn't last long, your only option was D&D. Created on a shoestring budget of around $2,000, D&D quickly became a hit. It sold a respectable 1,000 copies in its first year, then 3,000 the next, and little by little, word of mouth turned it into a cultural phenomenon. In no time, it became part of US pop culture, even getting its own Saturday morning cartoon. But that success would soon bring problems. In the 1980s, something strange was happening in the US, a period known as the Satanic Panic. Thousands of people across the country and eventually the world were accused of practicing satanic rituals and human sacrifices. Many people went to prison and are still there today, despite being clearly innocent. If you ever heard someone claim your favorite video game or anime was satanic, this explains why. It all started because of a book called Michelle Remembers, which falsely claimed that a woman had been the victim of a satanic cult. It didn't matter that the story was in fact fiction despite how it was sold, but people didn't know or didn't care. And in the middle of all this panic, with its pagan symbols and monsters, D&D became the obvious scapegoat and enemy number one in the USA. Honestly, what did you expect was going to happen to a game where teenagers gathered around basements to play with, yeah, pagan symbols and monsters? Not blaming D&D or anything, just saying. But if D&D was so hated, how did it survive? And how it is more popular today than ever? To answer that, we need to go back to Japan in the 1980s, because understanding how D&D evolved there shows us exactly how it managed to survive against all odds back home in the US. In the 1980s, Japan wasn't really a fantasy-loving country, at least not in the way we think of fantasy today. To understand why, you need to understand something about religion in Japan. Religion in Japan exists in the weird place where most people don't really believe in it, but they also kind of do at the same time. You see, there are people who practice more than one religion at the same time, sometimes without even realizing it, and nobody has a problem with that. There's actually a name for it, Shimbutsu Shugo, the practice of mixing Buddhist and Shinto rituals, the two most popular popular religions in Japan. But here's the strange part. Most people don't truly believe in this stuff. It's more like a cultural tradition. Think of it like a superstition. You probably had a lucky number or a lucky object or a ritual, and you might occasionally check your horoscope. You don't necessarily believe in it, but it's just what you do. That's basically how religion works in Japan. Now, there are two big reasons for this. The first is Confucianism, a philosophy from China that doesn't put religion at the center of everything. Unlike, say, Christianity societies, Confucianism teaches that the most important thing is the group, the collective, and the religion comes after. That's also one of the reasons East Asia societies tend to be more collectivist, meaning the group matters more than the individual, while places like Europe and America tend to be more individualist. The second reason is Shinto itself, Japan's oldest religion. Going back to prehistoric times, Shinto is incredibly decentralized. There's no central leader, no single important text like the Bible or the Torah. The gods are everywhere, and they can be anything. A mountain, a tree, a rock, can all be a god. According to Shinto, certain animals or everyday objects can come alive or become gods if they are old enough or if certain events happen to them. It is a religion with many different streams of belief, where a shrine might just be a rock in the middle of the sea. I go more in detail in this video if you are interested. Because of all of this, because Shinto is so tied to everyday ordinary life, and because it's changed so many times throughout history, it's not an epic religion. It's not a grand story of good versus evil. It's just there, quietly every day. And here's where my theory comes in. The foundation of Western fantasy is The Lord of the Rings, a grand epic story of good versus evil. And I'm not the first person to notice how heavily Tolkien, the creator of the story, drew from the Bible to build his world. He even said so himself. So it stands to reason that a story built so deeply on Christian themes would have a harder time landing in a country where Christianity was never big, right? And I mean, probably? But then again, you could say the same thing about Dragon Ball from Japan's perspective, and that's huge all over the world. So while the Christian undertones may have made it a tougher sell in Japan, that alone doesn't explain why The Lord of the Rings wasn't huge in Japan, but the following does. The Lord of the Rings didn't arrive in Japan until the 1970s, and when it did, it came with a cold, flat adaptation that stripped away much of the original charm. So for a long time, fantasy, and by that I mean medieval fantasy, wasn't a big deal in Japan because Lord of the Rings wasn't a big deal there. Sure, there were anime and manga that were technically fantasy, for example, stories featuring yokai and Japanese spirits like Gegege no Kitaro or Dorohedoro, but they weren't grand epic adventures. They were more slice of life stories where the supernatural just kind of existed alongside everyone. And that makes sense because instead of drawing from European myths and legends like Western fantasy did, these stories drew from Shinto mythology, and as I mentioned, Shinto keeps things pretty grounded. After all, in Shinto, a tree can be a god and a shrine can be a rock in the middle of the ocean. For real epic storytelling in Japan, people look to science fiction and space operas. This was almost certainly a consequence of the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan during World War II. Many of the most popular and influential stories of the era, works that would become global icons like Godzilla or Astro Boy, were allegories for nuclear bombs and the aftermath of them. And this combined with Japan's rapid modernization after the war shaped what would become otaku culture. The original otaku were science fiction fans. You can see this clearly in the 1960s. In the 1960s, Japan had magazines like SF Magazine, a successful sci-fi publication that still runs today. And in 1962, Japan held its first science fiction convention. And those conventions were where much of the anime and manga fanbase was born. Take Gainax, the studio behind Evangelion, Gurren Lagann, and Furikuri. Have you ever noticed that a lot of their shows feature a female character in a red bunny suit? There's a reason for that. The founder of Gainax, including Evangelion creator Hideaki Anno, got their start in animation by making Daikon 3 and Daikon 4, a pair of fan-made animations for one of those sci-fi conventions. That's also why those animations are packed with reference to Star Wars, because even though the creators didn't originally wanted to include them, every otaku at those conventions was obsessed with sci-fi, and Star Wars was the biggest thing around. Yes, I know Star Wars is more science fantasy than sci-fi, but space, robots, you get it. The point is this: because of World World War II and Japan's rapid industrialization, audiences wanted science fiction. That's why the biggest early anime franchises, Gundam, Space Battleship Yamato, Mazinger Z, Macross, are all heavy on sci-fi themes. Even though even more fantasy-leaning stories like Fist of the North Star or Dragon Ball had strong sci-fi elements, post-nuclear winters, futuristic technology, time travel, aliens, etc. So when a few people started importing D&D and other tabletop RPGs in this era, it stood out. Its focus on epic medieval fantasy and its huge roster full of new monsters and creatures was genuinely fresh and exciting. Since JRPGs were just barely getting started, it was different from the science fiction that they were used to. It wasn't just a story, you were part of the story. With some restrictions, you could do basically anything. Let your imagination go completely wild. Still, at this stage, D&D was only known by a small group of people who had the connections to order it or could afford the high import cost. In many cases, players were members of clubs at a handful of universities in a few major cities. For practically all of Japan, D&D didn't exist, but that was about to change. In 1984, the first official tabletop RPG arrived in Japan, a game called Traveler, which had a sci-fi setting. Remember what I told you about science fiction being big in Japan? The following year, in 1985, something happened that would change the history of Japanese fantasy forever. D&D officially arrived in Japan, and it was a genuine hit. The iconic red box, the basic set, sold over 100,000 copies in its first year. Why did it take off so easily? Well, a few years earlier, two video games had already laid the groundwork. Ultima from 1981 and Wizardry from also 1981. Both were made in the US with a Western-style medieval aesthetic, and both are among the most influential games in the history of gaming. They are the foundation of all RPG video games and by extension all JRPGs. Don't believe me? The top-down world map view? That's Ultima. A karma system? That's Ultima. First-person dungeon exploration? That's Wizardry. Random encounters? Wizardry. Turn-based stat combat? Both, but mostly Wizardry. Both games were massive in Japan. But here's where something interesting happens. In the West, Ultima ended up being more influential, with its expansive open worlds, its heavy focus on exploration and interactivity, and its story centered on a single protagonist. Meanwhile, in Japan, Wizardry was king. Its dungeon crawlers, punishing difficulty, random encounters, and party-based system. This divide is actually really important, and it connects to a debate you probably heard before. What exactly makes a JRPG a JRPG? Is it just a game made in Japan? What about a game made by Westerns in Japan? Does it count? Or what about a game made by Japanese developers but made in the West? Or a game made in Japan by Japanese developers but designed specifically for a Western audience? Is Dark Souls a JRPG? This debate is basically the gaming equivalent of what is anime. Everyone has a take and nobody fully agrees. But in my opinion, most of those answers are missing the point. And that's basically missing the forest for the trees. Instead of dissecting every mechanic and every pixel, the better question is, what was the intent, and more importantly, what were the influences? Because here's the thing, the stat systems in Skyrim, Final Fantasy, and Pokemon, those numbers calculating your attack damage and stat grow, those came from Ultima and Wizardry, who got them directly from D&D. That was literally how you translated tabletop dice roll and character creation into a computer. Same with dungeons, class systems, probability in combat, and more. So the foundation of all RPGs is D&D, especially in the West, where many game designers in the 80s and 90s grew up playing D&D and knew exactly what they were building on. But in Japan, things are more complicated. In the West, D&D came first and everything else followed. In Japan, everything else came first and then D&D arrived. One of the first JRPGs to use a medieval fantasy aesthetic was arguably Toei's The Dragon and the Princess, released in 1982, 3 years before D&D officially arrived in Japan. By the time D&D showed up in 1984, many of the aesthetics and concepts that might have made it feel fresh were already familiar. Still fresh, but not brand new. And that same year, Wizardry also got its official Japanese release. Then, in 1986, just 1 year after D&D arrived, Dragon Quest launched. You know Dragon Quest, right? The #1 JRPG franchise in Japan. The series that sold so well viral that, according to legend, its publishers stopped releasing main series entries on weekdays because workers and students would literally skip school and work just to buy it on launch day. And while that was never officially confirmed, the fact is that to this day, no mainline Dragon Quest game has launched on a weekday. Well, that Dragon Quest came out just 1 year after D&D, and in many ways, it became its biggest rival for the crown of medieval fantasy property. But why does all this history matter? Because by 1986, medieval fantasy fever was everywhere among Japanese otakus. You could see it in anime, in manga, in video games, and in that same year, something happened that would turn D&D into a genuine pop culture moment in Japan. You can see this video I made for more info on the subject of PC gaming in Japan, but one of the most popular PC magazines among otakus at the time was Conpic. You can tell it was big with that crowd just by what it looks like today. In 1986, at the peak of Japan's medieval fantasy craze, Conpic started publishing Record of Lodoss War. What was Record of Lodoss War? It was a replay. A replay is a recorded account of a tabletop RPG session. Everything said and done, both in and out of character, is written down and shared. Replays are fundamental to tabletop RPG culture in Japan. They are not just how people learn about a specific game. They are how people learn to play a specific game, or how a lot of people get into the hobby in the first place. Today, you will find them in a novelized form in bookstores, but the most popular version right now is video. Produced used hacked visual novels engine where illustrated characters speak over changing backgrounds, voiced by Vocaloid software. Yes, the same technology that gives voice to Hatsune Miku. The Record of Lodoss War replays were produced by a group called Group SNE. They were the ones actually playing D&D in those sessions, and those replays became hugely popular both inside and outside of the tabletop RPG community, turning D&D into a national sensation and eventually leading the company behind D&D to launch their own dedicated magazine for D&D. So if it was so successful, why isn't D&D huge in Japan today? And why is there no D&D anime or an anime about playing tabletop RPGs? I mean, there's an anime for every hobby, and I'm not kidding here. There are 3 key reasons that explains the downfall of D&D and of the entire tabletop RPG genre in Japan. I want you to think about the following. If you made a movie, cartoon, or TV show in the West depicting the lives of nerds, the Western equivalent of otakus, you'd almost certainly show them playing D&D at some point. There's a reason why Stranger Things has D&D woven through all 5 seasons. But in Japan, there's no equivalent. Here's why. The 3 reasons are as it follows. The first one is that, while not the most important reason, shouldn't come as a surprise, TSR, the company behind D&D at the time, made some bad calls. At the time, the Japanese rights to D&D were split between 2 companies, Shinwa, which handled the physical games distribution, and Kadokawa Shoten, which handled basically everything else: novels, magazine, replays, etc. Having the rights divided like that made coordinating any big project a real headache. But the biggest mistake came from TSR itself, when Group SNE, the creators of Record of Lodoss War, the people who had essentially made D&D a household name in Japan, wanted to publish a book version of their replay sessions. They wanted the title to include the name Dungeons and Dragons, not just for branding purposes, but basically because they were genuine fans who had started the Record of Lodoss War project specifically to share D&D with more people and grow the community. TSR said no. They could publish Lodoss War, but not under the D&D label, only as Record of Lodoss War. This turned out to be a massive mistake. Record of Lodoss War went on to become a huge franchise, with more than 20 novels selling over 10 million copies worldwide, published across the globe. I could literally walk into my bookstore on the other side of the world in Mexico in 2026 and buy a translated version. It spawned a successful 50+ episode anime, and it still has stage plays and a new video game coming soon. And its impact on fantasy in Japan is enormous. For example, have you noticed how elves look different in anime versus Western fantasy? In the West, elves like Legolas have short, pointy ears. Meanwhile, in Japan, they usually have these long ears. Also, dark elves in the West tend to have a very dark, almost shadow-like skin. Meanwhile, in Japan, they often have a lighter skin. That's because the character Diddly, the mascot of Record of Lodoss War, and Pyrotes became so iconic that they shaped the visual language of fantasy characters in anime for decades. But that's not even close to the biggest impact Lodoss War had. For that, we need to get to the second reason. D&D simply refused to adapt to how Japan worked. The books arrived as big, expensive book, but the standard book format in Japan is bunkoban or tankobon, paperback sizes about as big as a manga volume. They are small, light, portable, and there's a reason for that. Space in Japan is extremely limited. This shapes everything about Japanese daily life, including the cultural preference for smaller, more compact things. In Japan, bigger isn't always better. There are even documented cases where people prefer a smaller drink over a large one because they feel the bigger size is just too much and would create a problem for them, even though they both are literally the same drink and have basically the same price. Now imagine holding a massive D&D hardcover through the crowded Tokyo subway system where more than 20 million people are packed to one mega city. And in Japan, privacy is a huge deal. When you buy a book at a bookstore, it's traditional for staff to wrap it in plain paper, specifically for privacy. That obviously doesn't scale when you are carrying a giant rulebook everywhere you go. You might think, why not just leave the book at someone's house and make it the permanent meeting spot? Valid question, but this isn't the US. Houses in Japan are small, many are multi-generational, and crucially, they don't have basements. The classic American image of nerds playing D&D in someone's basement exists for a reason. A basement gives you enough space for a group of people where they won't bother the rest of the household. That doesn't exist in Japan. And on top of that, people in Japan famously work extremely long hours. Scheduling a session is hard. Now imagine also having to cross a megacity to get there. This is actually why today in Japan, if people play tabletop games in person, they usually do it at dedicated tabletop gaming cafes and venues. But the clearest proof of TSR, lack of engagement, whether through indifference or plain ignorance, was still coming. Remember Group SNE, the creators of Record of Lotus War, who weren't allowed to publish under the D&D name? In 1989, when they prepared a second replay for publication, they didn't use D&D at all. Instead, they used Sword World, their own tabletop RPG system based on D&D but fully under their control. And it became a bigger hit than D&D in Japan. Sword World sold over 500,000 copies, and as a result, in Japan, unlike the rest of the world, that game synonymous with tabletop RPGs isn't Dungeons & Dragons, it's Sword World. Part of what made Sword World so successful beyond the replays was that it actually listened to what Japanese players needed. For example, Japan is famously not the most socially spontaneous country. There's a reason they have more vending machines per capita than almost everywhere else in the world. It's not just because it's cheaper for the companies, it's also because that way you can buy something without having to interact with anyone. And that doesn't mean people don't want to connect. It just means many prefer to skip the awkwardness of small talk or worry about being a burden to others. Sword World addresses this with a system called Fellows, a kind of spirit companion that any player could create and share for others to use in their sessions. These fellows had preset phrases, could disappear but never really die, and could help you in battle, similar in spirit to the cooperative summon system in Dark Souls. But Sword World went further. It actively encouraged players to thank the creator of a fellow that helped them, and shared stories about their interactions, how that fellow cheered you on when you were about to lose a battle, or was there when your character got married. Pretty wholesome, honestly. And there's more. Sword World introduced ideas that would later become staples of fan anime. Adventurers guilds, the rule that adventurers can't attack each other, and levels as something that characters themselves are aware of and talk about it in the story, not just something happening in the background. That last one might sound familiar if you've watched any Isekai anime recently. Sword World also solved a very practical problem. Back then in Japan, it was incredibly hard to find the multi-sided dice that D&D required, like the 20-sided die. Sword World solved this by building its entire system around the standard 6-sided die that everyone already owned, and unlike Western campaigns that would stretch across multiple sessions over days or even weeks, Sword World from its second edition onward favored short sessions of just a few hours. You show up, play, and finish in one sitting. That fits Japanese schedules and lifestyles perfectly. In many ways, Japanese tabletop RPGs became friendlier to their audiences. Shorter sessions, more freedom to roleplay, and an openness to players building characters inspired by magical girls, idol performers, characters from their favorite series. That kind of creative freedom exists in D&D too, but it's not actively encouraged in the same way Japanese tabletop RPGs do. But none of that is the most important reason why D&D is failing in Japan today. For that, you need to look at what's actually the biggest tabletop RPG in Japan right now. It's not D&D. It's not even Sword World, though Sword World is still popular. It's Call of Cthulhu, which sells more copies in Japan alone than in all the other countries combined. There are a lot of reasons for that, including the light novel series Nyaruko Crawling with Love, which became an anime and featured Lovecraftian gods reimagined imagined as cute anime girls. Cthulhu is a Lovecraftian god, so the crossover appeal is obvious. Call of Cthulhu also isn't focused on combat, which likely explains its massive popularity among female players. But what I want you to notice is the genre. Call of Cthulhu is mystery and horror, not medieval fantasy, not epic adventure, and that, in my opinion, it's the real reason why D&D failed in Japan. In the West, D&D survived the satanic panic because it was the one that started everything. The game designers and fantasy fans who built the entire RPG industry knew that it all traced it back to D&D. So no matter how bad things got, D&D remained the foundation, the reference point for the entire genre. In Japan, D&D was never that. It wasn't even the first tabletop RPG to arrive. It isn't what sparked the medieval fantasy boom, and it was never seen as anything special. As a result, tabletop RPGs in Japan remain pretty niche to this day. And because of that, the creators of JRPGs didn't draw inspiration from D&D directly. They drew from Wizardry and Ultima, games that were themselves inspired by D&D. In Japan, everyone was building on things that had been inspired by D&D, but nobody was inspired by D&D itself. To Japan, D&D was just a footnote.